Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. Inside the Federal Supermax transport system. Before an inmate ever moves toward ADX Florence, the process has already been set in motion. Quietly, deliberately, and far from public view. There are no sirens, no public schedules, no visible announcements. Federal Supermax transport is designed to be invisible, unlike state prison systems, where transfers may involve predictable routes or routine movement schedules. The federal system treats Supermax transport as a national-level security operation. Each transfer is treated not simply as inmate movement, but as controlled federal action, coordinated across multiple agencies, reviewed through layered approvals, and executed under strict confidentiality. The reason is simple. Inmates assigned to or moved from ADX Florence are classified as extreme management risks. These are individuals deemed capable of orchestrating violence, influencing criminal networks, or destabilizing institutions even while incarcerated. For federal authorities, movement itself becomes a highest-risk moment. Inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons, transport to a Supermax facility is not viewed as logistics. It is viewed as exposure. Exposure to escape attempts. Exposure to external interference. Exposure to internal failures. As a result, the system is designed so that no single person ever controls the entire operation. A system built on separation. Federal Supermax transport begins with a structural principle known internally as operational compartmentalization. No officer sees the full plan. No escort team knows the final destination until necessary. No transport route exists as a single fixed path. Instead, responsibility is divided across classification units, transport coordinators, regional command staff, and on-road escort leaders. Each group handles only its assigned phase. This separation reduces risk. If information is compromised at one point, the system absorbs the damage without collapsing. Even inmates themselves are never informed of the transfer timeline until the moment extraction begins. For those being moved toward ADX Florence, uncertainty is intentional. Why Supermax transport exists? ADX Florence was designed not just to confine inmates, but to neutralize influence. Many prisoners housed there were not violent inside prison walls, but were considered capable of directing criminal activity from within standard facilities. Federal transport policies reflect this philosophy. Movement must prevent communication, prevent prediction, prevent pattern recognition, prevent outside coordination. That is why Supermax transfers are rarely direct. An inmate may pass through multiple secure holding points, temporary detention centers, or federal transfer hubs before ever reaching Colorado. The journey is not about distance. It is about disorientation and control, authority without visibility. Every Supermax transfer is authorized through a chain that begins with federal classification review and ends with central office approval. But the paperwork itself tells only part of the story. Behind each approval lies threat assessments, behavioral histories, intelligence summaries, prior institutional incidents, communication monitoring data. None of this information is public. Most of it never appears in court filings. The result is a system that operates almost entirely outside public awareness, even though it involves some of the most heavily restricted prisoners in the country. This secrecy is not accidental. It is policy, the quiet role of the U.S. Marshals. While the Federal Bureau of Prisons manages inmate custody, transport authority is often shared with the U.S. Marshals Service, especially when court appearances, interdistrict transfers, or high-risk movements are involved. The Marshals bring a different operational culture, fugitive tracking experience, secure convoy planning, interagency coordination, rapid response capability. When Marshals are involved, transport plans become multi-layered federal operations, sometimes involving air transport, decoy movements, or route substitutions conducted in real time. Yet even then, the public sees nothing. No markings, no announcements, no indication that a Federal Supermax inmate is moving through civilian space. The moment most failures occur, Federal Oversight reviews consistently identify transport as the highest risk phase of incarceration. not because inmates escape frequently, but because transport introduces variables that do not exist inside fixed walls. Traffic conditions, mechanical failures, public exposure, weather, human error. For Supermax inmates, even a minor disruption can escalate quickly. That is why federal protocols emphasize redundancy. Every transport includes backup restraints, alternate routes, secondary escort vehicles, contingency detention locations. If one element fails, another immediately replaces it. The goal is not efficiency. The goal is containment without interruption. Psychological control as security. Supermax transport is not only physical, it is psychological. Inmates are moved with limited sensory input, minimal verbal communication, no confirmation of destination, no awareness of timing. This is intentional. Federal correctional manuals emphasize that predictability increases resistance, while uncertainty reduces it. By eliminating routine, inmates are deprived of the ability to plan, signal, or prepare. Transport becomes another extension of Supermax confinement. The inmate is moved, but never in control, a system designed not to be seen. Most Americans will never witness a federal Supermax transport. They will not recognize the vehicles. They will not notice the escort patterns. They will not know when a movement occurs. That invisibility is the system working as intended. Supermax transport is not meant to reassure the public. It is meant to function without acknowledgement. And yet, behind that silence exists one of the most complex and tightly controlled correctional operations in the United States, one that blends federal authority, intelligence analysis, and absolute procedural discipline. This chapter is only the beginning, because before an inmate is ever restrained, before extraction teams arrive, and before a single mile is traveled, the system must decide who moves, why, and when. That process begins long before the doors open. How federal transfers begin: authority, classification, and court oversight ***. Long before restraints are prepared or transport vehicles are positioned. Every federal Supermax transfer begins with a decision that is never made lightly. In the federal system, movement is not routine, especially when it involves inmates bound for or departing from ADX Florence. There is no single order that starts the process. There is no lone official who decides. Instead, transfers emerge from a layered authority structure designed to distribute responsibility, reduce bias, and prevent unilateral action. Each movement must survive scrutiny at multiple institutional levels before it ever becomes operational. The role of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. At the center of all federal inmate movement is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The BOP does not treat transfers as administrative convenience. It treats them as security determinations grounded in classification science, behavioral analysis, and institutional risk forecasting. Every federal inmate is assigned a custody classification score, which is continuously updated throughout incarceration. This score incorporates sentence length and offense severity, institutional behavior and disciplinary history, escape risk indicators, external influence potential, intelligence flags, and communication monitoring. For most inmates, classification determines housing level. For a small fraction, it determines movement eligibility. ADX Florence transfers sit at the very top of the system. What triggers a Supermax transfer review? Federal reviews for Supermax transfer can be triggered by several documented factors. Sustained disruptive behavior across multiple facilities. Credible intelligence suggesting continued criminal direction from prison. Threats to institutional order or staff safety. Failure of lesser restrictive housing to control influence. Court-ordered relocation following appeals or resentencing. Importantly, a single incident is rarely enough. Federal policy emphasizes patterns over moments. The BOP looks for escalation, persistence, adaptation. An inmate who learns how to manipulate standard security environments is more likely to trigger review than one who commits isolated violations. This approach minimizes reactionary transfers and strengthens the system's legal defensibility. Classification committees and documentation. Once a trigger is identified, the case enters a formal classification review process. This process is conducted by a multidisciplinary committee that may include unit managers, case managers, correctional supervisors, intelligence analysts, mental health professionals. Each participant contributes documentation, not opinion. Behavioral summaries, communication logs, incident reports, and prior transfer outcomes are compiled into a classification packet. This packet may exceed hundreds of pages and is often reviewed multiple times before approval advances. Nothing moves forward without written justification. Central office approval, where transfers are decided. For Supermax level movement, local approval is not enough. Final authority rests with BOP Central Office, which reviews classification packets to ensure policy compliance, proportionality, legal sufficiency, risk mitigation planning. Central office approval exists to prevent misuse of ADX Florence as a punitive shortcut. Federal courts have repeatedly scrutinized Supermax placements, and the BOP is acutely aware that every decision must withstand potential judicial review. As a result, documentation must justify not only the move, but the necessity of maximum isolation, court involvement, and judicial oversight. Not all Supermax transfers originate internally. Federal courts may also initiate or influence inmate movement, particularly in cases involving appeals, post-conviction hearings, resentencing, competency evaluations. In these situations, coordination between the BOP and the U.S. Marshals Service becomes critical. Courts do not dictate transport methods. They authorize custody movement. How that movement occurs remains entirely within federal correctional discretion. This separation preserves judicial neutrality while allowing security professionals to control operational details. Why timing is never disclosed. Once approval is granted, timing becomes one of the most tightly controlled variables in the entire system. Transport schedules are classified as sensitive operational information. Reasons include prevention of coordinated external interference, reduction of staff exposure risk, avoidance of inmate anticipation or preparation, elimination of predictable movement patterns. Even within institutions, notice is often limited to hours, not days. For inmates, transfer awareness often begins only when extraction teams arrive. This policy has been upheld repeatedly in federal oversight reviews as a legitimate security measure. Medical, psychological, and legal clearances. Before movement can proceed, additional clearances are required. Federal policy mandates, medical fitness verification, mental health stability assessments, legal status confirmation. An inmate cannot be transported if doing so would create immediate medical risk or violate court-imposed restrictions. These checks are not optional. They are mandatory safeguards. If an issue is identified, the transfer is delayed, not canceled, until compliance is achieved. The hidden importance of interagency coordination. For high-risk inmates, the BOP does not operate alone. Transport planning may involve U.S. Marshals Service, Federal Protective Service, local law enforcement coordination without disclosure of inmate identity. Each agency is briefed only on what it must know. This need-to-know structure ensures cooperation without unnecessary exposure. No single agency holds the entire picture. Paperwork is a shield. To the public, paperwork appears bureaucratic. Inside the federal transport system, it is a shield. Every approval form, clearance check, and classification summary exists to establish accountability, protect staff from liability, demonstrate procedural fairness, prevent abuse of authority. When Supermax transfers are challenged in court, it is this documentation, not testimony, that determines legitimacy. The system is built to defend itself through records. When approval becomes action, once all approvals are secured, the case shifts from administrative authority to operational control. At that point, transport coordinators are notified. Extraction teams are placed on standby. Routes begin preliminary planning. Equipment checks commence. Still, nothing moves yet. Authorization does not mean execution. That transition marks one of the most critical moments in the entire process, because once the order is live, reversal becomes difficult. From this point forward, every step must be synchronized, because the next phase is where risk becomes physical. Closing transition. Federal Supermax transport does not begin with handcuffs or vehicles. It begins with classification codes, approvals, and silent signatures, each one narrowing the path forward until movement becomes inevitable. By the time an inmate is notified, the decision has already passed through layers of authority designed to ensure that transfer is not just justified, but unavoidable. And once that threshold is crossed, preparation accelerates, because the next stage does not involve paperwork. It involves isolation, lockdowns, and extraction, pre-transfer isolation, security lockdowns, and movement restrictions ***. Once a Federal Supermax transfer has been authorized, the system enters a phase that is never visible to public and rarely discussed outside internal correctional documentation. This phase is not about movement. It is about stillness. Before an inmate is ever extracted for transport to or from ADX Florence, federal policy mandates a period of pre-transfer isolation and institutional lockdown controls. These measures exist to stabilize the environment, reduce unpredictability, and strip away variables that could compromise security. In the federal system, movement is safest when everything else stops. Why isolation comes before transport? Federal Oversight reviews consistently identify pre-movement instability as one of the leading contributors to transport incidents. Even inmates who comply during transport may attempt to pass messages beforehand, signal outside contacts, manipulate staff schedules, create distractions inside housing units. Pre-transfer isolation is designed to interrupt all of that. This isolation is not disciplinary. It is preventative. Once transfer authorization is active, the inmate is removed from routine institutional life and placed into a controlled pre-movement status. Suspension of normal privileges. During this phase, routine privileges are temporarily suspended. This may include commissary access, program participation, social interactions, non-essential movement, unscheduled communication. The goal is not punishment. The goal is predictability. By limiting variables, staff gain full control over the environment in which extraction will occur. This period can last hours or days, depending on risk assessments and logistical requirements. Controlled communication restrictions. One of the most critical components of pre-transfer isolation involves communication controls. Federal policy allows temporary restriction of phone access, electronic messaging, informal inmate-to-inmate contact. Written correspondence may be delayed or monitored more closely during this period. This prevents inmates from alerting external associates, coordinating resistance, spreading rumors that destabilize housing units. Communication restriction is always documented and reviewed to ensure compliance with legal standards. Housing unit lockdowns. In many cases, pre-transfer preparation triggers localized housing unit lockdowns. These lockdowns may restrict movement of other inmates, adjust staff assignments, limit access points within the unit. Importantly, lockdowns are often indirect. Other inmates may not be told why movement is restricted. They are simply informed that operational needs require temporary control. This reduces speculation and prevents targeted interference. Environmental control inside the cell. During isolation, the inmate's immediate environment is deliberately simplified. Federal procedure emphasizes removal of excess personal property, securing of fixtures and furnishings, inspection of clothing and bedding, inventory of permitted items, anything that could conceal contraband, be used for self-harm, interfere with restraints, is addressed before extraction teams arrive. The cell itself becomes part of the security system. Medical and mental health monitoring. Contrary to public assumption, pre-transfer isolation does not eliminate medical oversight. In fact, monitoring often increases. Medical staff conduct, vital checks, medication verification, mental health assessments. These evaluations ensure the inmate is medically fit for transport, not experiencing acute psychological distress. Cleared under federal care standards. Transport cannot proceed if these conditions are not met. This safeguard protects both staff and inmate, and it preserves the legal integrity of the transfer. Staff briefings and access control. While the inmate is isolated, staff preparation intensifies. Access to the housing area becomes restricted to essential correctional officers, supervisory staff, medical personnel. Non-essential staff are rerouted. Shift briefings emphasize operational confidentiality, chain of command clarity, response protocols. No single officer is given full operational details. This ensures that if information leaks, it remains incomplete. The role of uncertainty. From the inmate's perspective, pre-transfer isolation introduces uncertainty by design. There is no confirmation of destination, timing, method of transport. This uncertainty is intentional. Federal correctional manuals recognize that predictability increases resistance, while uncertainty reduces it. When inmates cannot anticipate events, they are less able to mentally prepare countermeasures, coordinate timing, test staff reactions. Isolation becomes a psychological containment strategy, managing institutional stability. Pre-transfer controls are not just about the inmate being moved. They are about protecting the institution itself. Supermax-level inmates often hold informal influence within facilities. Their movement, if mishandled, can trigger rumors, tension, retaliation, disruptive behavior. By isolating the process, administrators ensure that the broader population remains unaffected. In many cases, other inmates may not even realize a transfer has occurred until long after it is complete. Documentation and oversight. Every restriction applied during pre-transfer isolation is documented. Records include time and duration of restrictions, justification for controls, medical clearance confirmations, staff assignments. This documentation serves multiple purposes: operational accountability, legal compliance, post-incident review. If a transfer is challenged later, these records demonstrate that measures were preventive, not punitive. When isolation ends, pre-transfer isolation ends not with notice, but with action. There is no announcement, no countdown. The transition from isolation to extraction happens swiftly. Once extraction teams arrive, the environment must already be stable, controlled, and predictable. Any delay at that stage increases risk. That is why everything before it is engineered for stillness. Closing transition. Before restraints are applied, before doors open, and before vehicles move, Federal Supermax transport relies on silence, isolation, and control. This phase removes uncertainty for staff by creating uncertainty for the inmate. It is not visible. It is not dramatic, but it is essential, because once isolation ends, the system shifts from preparation to execution. And the next phase is the most direct contact point between inmate and authority. That is where extraction begins. Extraction procedures. How federal teams remove a high-risk inmate ***. When pre-transfer isolation ends, the system moves into its most controlled and deliberate phase. Extraction. This is the moment when planning becomes physical and when the highest level of federal transport discipline is required. For inmates moving to or from ADX Florence, extraction is not an improvisation. It is a scripted procedure refined through decades of federal correctional oversight. There are no shortcuts. There is no urgency unless policy demands it. Everything about extraction is designed to minimize unpredictability. Why extraction teams exist. Federal Supermax extraction is not performed by routine housing officers. Instead, specially trained teams are assigned based on risk classification, behavioral history, medical considerations, intelligence assessments. These teams operate under standardized federal guidelines that prioritize containment control and safety for all parties involved. The purpose of a specialized team is simple: to ensure that no single officer is required to manage risk alone. Advanced positioning and silent readiness. Before an inmate is ever aware that extraction is imminent, the environment is already secured. Officers. Confirm control of adjacent cells. Secure access points and corridors. Position restraint equipment outside the housing area. Establish communication with command staff. Movement within the unit is restricted. This preparation is quiet by design. Sudden changes or visible urgency can escalate stress or resistance. Federal protocols emphasize calm, neutral presence. Command authority during extraction. Extraction operates under a clear chain of command. One supervisor holds operational authority for the procedure. That authority includes initiating contact, approving restraint application, directing movement, halting the process if conditions change. This centralized command prevents conflicting instructions and ensures accountability. Every order given during extraction is documented. Initial contact with the inmate. Extraction begins with verbal compliance attempts. Federal policy requires officers to identify themselves, issue clear, concise instructions, allow reasonable time for compliance. Force is not the first option. In many cases, compliance is achieved without physical intervention. For Supermax inmates, resistance during extraction is statistically uncommon, not because inmates are cooperative, but because uncertainty and prior isolation reduce confrontation. When compliance occurs, the procedure proceeds without escalation. When resistance is anticipated, if intelligence assessments indicate potential resistance, teams prepare accordingly. Preparation may include additional personnel, enhanced restraint systems, medical staff on standby. However, preparation does not mean aggression. Federal doctrine emphasizes proportional response. Force is used only when necessary to gain control and only to the extent required. This approach is designed to withstand legal scrutiny and internal review. Restraint application. Once compliance is secured, restraint are applied in a specific sequence. While exact methods vary by assessment, federal transport standards typically involve hand restraints applied behind the body, waist chains or control belts, leg restraints when required. Restraints are double-checked for proper fit, circulation safety, security integrity. The goal is immobilization without injury. Medical staff may observe restraint application if conditions warrant. Escort formation and movement control. Once restrained, the inmate is positioned within an escort formation. Escort teams maintain physical control at all times. Position officers to monitor balance and movement. Control pace and direction. Movement is slow and deliberate. Rushing increases risk. Stopping unnecessarily increases exposure. Federal procedures specify continuous motion until the inmate reaches a secure transition point. Environmental control during movement. During extraction, environmental variables are tightly managed. Doors are open only when necessary, closed immediately after passage. Corridors are cleared of non-essential personnel, monitored by supervisory staff. This ensures the inmate is never exposed to uncontrolled space. Even brief exposure increases risk. Communication discipline. Throughout extraction, communication is limited and functional. Officers' use. Standardized commands. Pre-agreed signals. Minimal verbal engagement. This reduces misunderstanding and emotional escalation. Personal conversation is prohibited. The focus remains on procedure. Transfer to secure holding. Extraction does not end at the housing unit door. Inmates are often transferred to a secure holding area where restraints are rechecked. Identification is verified. Final clearances are confirmed. Only after this stage does transport coordination proceed. This pause allows supervisors to confirm that all procedures were followed and that the inmate is stable. Oversight and review. Every extraction is subject to review. Documentation includes timestamps, personnel involved, compliance level, any use of force, medical observations. If force was used, additional review layers are triggered. This oversight ensures that extraction remains controlled, justified, and defensible. Why extraction is designed to be uneventful. To outside observers, federal extraction may appear anticlimactic. That is intentional. The most successful extraction is the one that draws no attention, creates no disruption, and leaves no lasting impact beyond the movement itself. Federal correctional policy does not reward spectacle. It rewards consistency. Closing transition. Extraction is the point where authority becomes tangible. It is where planning meets physical control and where every previous phase is tested. If preparation was thorough, extraction proceeds smoothly. If preparation failed, risk emerges instantly. Once extraction is complete, the inmate is no longer part of the institution's routine population. They have entered a different system, one defined by restraint, mobility, and constant supervision, because the next phase does not happen inside walls. It happens on the road. Restraint protocols, how federal systems lock down high-risk inmates during transport. Once extraction is complete, control does not relax. It intensifies. For inmates moving to or from ADX Florence, restraints are not simply security tools. They are part of an integrated control system designed to limit movement, prevent communication, and eliminate opportunity during the most vulnerable phase of incarceration, transport. In the federal system, restraint protocols are standardized, documented, and legally scrutinized. Every application must balance security with medical safety, and every step must be defensible after the fact. There is no improvisation. Why transport requires a different level of restraint. Inside a prison, walls provide security. During transport, restraints replace walls. Federal oversight data consistently identifies inmate movement as a period of highest exposure. Vehicles move through uncontrolled environments. Staff are limited in number. External variables cannot be eliminated. As a result, restraint protocols during Supermax transport are designed to prevent sudden movement, limit reach and leverage, reduce communication ability, maintain continuous physical control. These protocols apply regardless of inmate behavior. Compliance does not reduce restraint level. Layered restraint systems. Federal transport restraint is never singular. It is layered. Common restraint configurations may include hand restraints secure behind the body, waist chains or control belts anchoring arm movement, leg restraints limiting stride length, secondary connectors preventing separation of components. Each layer serves a different purpose. If one restraint fails, others maintain control. Redundancy is intentional. Fit, positioning, and medical considerations. Before transport begins, restraints are checked for proper fit, circulation safety, pressure points, range limitation. Federal policy requires that restraints do not restrict breathing, do not impair circulation, do not create unnecessary pain. Medical personnel may observe or verify restraint application when indicated. If a medical issue arises, transport pauses, not proceeds. This safeguard exists to protect both the inmate and the integrity of the operation. The role of control devices. In certain cases, additional control devices may be authorized. These devices are not punitive. They are preventative. Their use is governed by risk assessment outcomes, prior transport behavior, intelligence indicators. Authorization must be documented, approved, and reviewed. Unauthorized restraint escalation is prohibited. Restraints and psychological control. Restraints serve a psychological function as well as a physical one. They reduce confidence in resistance, reinforce loss of control, signal the seriousness of the operation. Federal correctional manuals acknowledge that predictability and comfort increase resistance potential. Transport restraint protocols are designed to eliminate both. Continuous monitoring during restraint. Once restraints are applied, monitoring begins. Escort officers are trained to observe breathing patterns, skin coloration, balance and posture, signs of distress. Monitoring continues throughout. Vehicle loading, transit, stops, transfers. If signs of distress appear, procedures require immediate assessment. Restraint safety is not optional. It is mandatory. Restraints and movement discipline. Restrained inmates are never allowed to move independently. Movement protocols require officer control at all times, regulated pace, controlled entry and exit from vehicles. Doors are open only when escort positions are secured. Command authorization is given. This discipline prevents sudden exposure. Documentation and accountability. Every restraint applied during federal transport is documented. Records include type of restraints used, time of application, personnel involved, observations during transport, any adjustments made. This documentation serves as legal protection, oversight evidence, training reference. If restraint use is questioned, documentation answers. Why restraints do not change based on destination. Whether an inmate is traveling a short distance or across states, restraint protocols remain consistent. Distance does not reduce risk. Familiarity does not reduce risk. Federal policy treats every Supermax transport as high risk by default. That consistency prevents complacency. The moment before movement. Once restraint is secured and verified, the inmate enters a brief holding phase. This pause allows final checks, command confirmation, vehicle readiness verification. Only when all elements align does movement begin. At that point, control shifts from institutional custody to mobile custody. Walls are gone. The road begins. Closing transition. Restraints are the backbone of Federal Supermax transport. They are not symbols. They are systems. Every chain, connector, and control point exists because movement creates opportunity, and opportunity creates risk. By the time transport vehicles begin to move, the inmate is already fully contained, monitored, and documented. But restraints alone are not enough, because once the journey begins, the system must manage not just the inmate, but the environment itself. That responsibility falls to vehicles, routes, and escort coordination, and that is where the next phase begins. Transport vehicles, reinforcements, design, and mobile security systems. Once restraints are secured and command authorization is confirmed, control shifts from the institution to the vehicle. At this point, walls no longer exist. The transport platform becomes a prison. For inmates moving to or from ADX Florence, vehicles are not merely transportation tools. They are engineered containment systems designed to replicate institutional security in motion. Every component, structure, layout, communication, and redundancy exists to compensate for the risks introduced by travel through public space. Why transport vehicles are treated as security assets. Federal transport vehicles are classified as security equipment, not standard fleet assets. They are selected and configured based on inmate risk level, transport distance, jurisdictional boundaries, escort composition, environmental exposure. A Supermax transport vehicle must function as a restraint reinforcement, a surveillance platform, a command extension, a mobile isolation chamber. Failure in any one of these areas compromises the entire operation. Reinforced structural design. Federal Supermax transport vehicles are reinforced well beyond civilian standards. Key structural features typically include reinforced door frames and hinges, interior partitions constructed to resist impact, secured window systems limiting visibility, interior surfaces designed to prevent tampering. These vehicles are built to withstand sudden stops, external interference, prolonged confinement use. Structural reinforcement ensures that the vehicle itself cannot be exploited as a tool for resistance. Interior compartmentalization. One of the most critical design elements is internal separation. Inmates are housed in individual secure compartments, areas isolated from the driver and escort team, spaces with limited sensory input. This compartmentalization prevents visual communication, physical contact, environmental awareness. By limiting what the inmate can see and hear, the system reduces psychological stimulation and disorientation is maintained. Escort positioning inside the vehicle. Escort officers are positioned strategically to maintain constant control without unnecessary proximity. Positions are chosen to monitor the inmate's condition, maintain physical dominance if required, avoid creating confrontation. Officers remain seated and restrain themselves when policy requires. The goal is stability, not engagement. Communication systems and command integration. Transport vehicles are fully integrated into federal communication networks. Standard systems include secure radio communication, redundant communication channels, GPS tracking monitored by command centers. This allows supervisors to monitor progress in real time, adjust routes dynamically, respond immediately to incidents. No Supermax transport operates independently. Every movement is overseen. Environmental control inside the vehicle. Temperature, lighting, and airflow inside transport compartments are controlled deliberately. Federal standards require adequate ventilation, safe temperature ranges, minimal environmental stress. These controls are not comfort-based. They are safety-based. An inmate experiencing medical distress during transport introduces risk for everyone involved. Environmental control reduces that risk. Vehicle loading procedures. Loading a Supermax inmate is one of the most vulnerable moments in the transport process. To mitigate this, vehicles are positioned to minimize exposure. Loading occurs in secured sally ports or controlled zones. Doors are open only when escort formation is confirmed. Timing is precise. Delays are avoided because exposure increases unpredictability. Redundancy and backup systems. Federal transport doctrine emphasizes redundancy. Vehicles are equipped with backup restraint anchors, secondary door locks, emergency signaling systems. Escort convoys may include led vehicles, follow vehicles, alternate transport options on standby. If one vehicle becomes compromised, transfer protocols allow rapid containment without improvisation. Why vehicles avoid identifiable markings. Supermax transport vehicles are intentionally discreet. They typically lack overt law enforcement markings, identifiable inmate transport indicators. This reduces public attention, targeting risk, external interference. An unnoticed transport is a safer transport. Monitoring during transit. Once the vehicle is moving, monitoring becomes continuous. Officers observe physical posture, breathing patterns, movement attempts, signs of distress. Command centers monitor speed, route adherence, stop duration. Any deviation triggers immediate review. Transport does not pause casually. Stops, delays, and exposure management. Federal Supermax transports are planned to minimize stops. When stops are unavoidable, locations are pre-approved, perimeters are secured, escort positioning is reinforced. Inmates are never exposed to public view. Even brief exposure creates unnecessary risk. Vehicle failure contingencies. Mechanical failure is treated as a security scenario. Protocols include immediate communication with command, secure containment procedures, alternate transport deployment. Inmates remain restrained and isolated until control is reestablished. Mechanical issues do not override security priorities. Why transport feels slow. From the outside, Federal Supermax transports may appear overly cautious. Inside the system, that caution is intentional. Speed creates error. Error creates opportunity. Vehicles move deliberately because precision, not urgency, defines success. Closing transition. By the time a Supermax transport vehicle enters public space, every variable has already been engineered to reduce risk. The vehicle is not simply carrying an inmate. It is carrying authority, oversight, and containment. But vehicles alone do not determine safety. The path they take, and how that path is controlled, defines the next level of risk, because movement through public space is unpredictable, and managing that unpredictability requires absolute control over routes, timing, and response authority. That is where the next phase begins.